All right, good morning, everyone. I think we will get started as people can still trickle in. My name is Ari Melber. I write for The Nation magazine. I always love doing blog panels. They're like blogs, but with a lot less people paying attention. So for the few of you who are actually in the room, this is a real treat. And basically, we've got a really great panel. We're not going to do formal opening statements, and we are going to leave a lot of time for interaction because obviously you're here, so you know something or have some interest in blogs, and this is, I think, by definition, a participatory medium. I want to start by just laying out the picture in Washington that I think blogs have been sketching. How many people here have seen the movie The Last Boy Scout? By a show of hands. All right. There's this scene in that movie, it's old, but there's a scene in the movie The Last Boy Scout that really captures contemporary Washington. Opening scene, it's near the end of a real tight football game and it's raining, and there's this player barreling down the field with the ball. And as other players come and they try to tackle him, out of the blue, he pulls out a gun and he starts shooting the other players on the field. And they're falling to the floor. So you see these bodies lying dead on the field, and you know you only have two options. You can rip the gun out of that player's hands, or you can kill him. But what you wouldn't do, what you couldn't do, is stand there and wait for the referees to fix the problem. Because in that moment, I would argue, the rules are irrelevant. And logic and ethics would require you to do something, not wait and hope that a referee or someone else off the field would fix the problem. I think that standoff on the football field is pretty close to what happened when you had a corrupt extremist band of Republicans take over Washington. They don't just play by some sort of alternative political rules. They break the rules. They break the law. They violate the Constitution. They upend the entire game, and they basically, in a sense, they make the referees, the press, or the judiciary, they make those referees largely irrelevant, at least in the moment that they're breaking the law. And they force a choice on the players on the field. The author Elizabeth Drew described this in writing that this administration made an unprecedented power grab by systematically attempting to defy, control, or threaten each institution that can challenge it: the Congress, the courts, and the press. So, where do we go with this? A lot of us know this. Excuse me. I would argue that basically for years, the liberal establishment, from incumbent Democrats to many liberal interest groups, failed that test in terms of being on the field and deciding what to do, how to confront that law-breaking, that corruption. And despite the danger and the brutality and the assault on our rule of law, people still operated by the old rules, and they got played. At the same time, even during those early days of the Bush administration, when what I'm saying I think was a more contested narrative, there was a different conversation and a more realistic confrontational politics developing online. Liberal bloggers presciently identified how the administration operated. They documented how it lied the nation into the war, how it broke the law. They exposed how it intimidated the press and exploited the imperatives of security and bipartisanship to build more partisan power and compromise our public safety. And bloggers relentlessly confronted the establishment for being complicit in the Bush administration's actions. Here's how Digby, who's with us today, explained it 2 years ago, quoting, "Bipartisanship is dead for the moment, and there's no margin in making deals. The rules have changed. When you capitulate to the Republicans for promises of something down the road, you're being a fool. When you make a deal with them for personal reasons, you're selling out your party." End quote. Still true. Now, we don't have to sink to the level of our opponents, but we do have to be rational in assessing their systematic assault on the rule of law and American democracy. We cannot allow politicians or reporters to pretend the rules haven't changed. So I think many of the arguments in the blogosphere, the intellectual scoops about what is happening, the political agenda about what to do, have already impacted the public debate and public opinion. With this knowledgeable audience, I don't need to list off all the examples. Yet even as some of these arguments gain traction, there's a preemptive backlash, right? It's something about the fashions of Washington ensure that partisanship always goes out of style when Democrats get near power, and compromise, we're told, is something only liberals have to do. But let's be clear, it's not just Washington. Whatever happens in this election, already millions of Americans have clearly cast a vote for what they see as a less partisan politics. And candidates in both parties have excelled by running on a sort of anti-politics, not just against Washington, a usual ploy, but really against ideology itself. And so my opening question for you, for our panelists, is what should we, as the Netroots or as citizens, make of this nonpartisan resurgence? Is it substantive? Is it naive? Can post-partisanship ever be truly progressive? And the big question for our entire conference, applied to the blogs, what role can or should bloggers play as an independent progressive voice in this general election and after January 2009? So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We're not doing formal openings, but they're going to speak to some of the questions I've raised and specific questions I've posed to them. Chris Bowers blogs for Open Left. He serves on the Pennsylvania State Democratic Committee. He's the treasurer of BlogPack. He began blogging full-time for MyDD in 2004, created the Liberal Blog Advertising Network, the Use It or Lose It campaign, which some of you may know, and the 2006 Google Bomb the Elections campaign. Tracy Russo was the chief blogger and deputy online communications director for the Edwards 2008 presidential campaign. And she previously handled online outreach for the DNC and has worked as a field organizer, fundraiser, and press secretary in Democratic politics. Digby runs the blog Digby's Hullabaloo and was basically at our last Take Back America conference last year. She came out, or disrobed, or what do you want to call it? She did not disrobe. She did not disrobe. She disclosed that her name is Heather Parton of Santa Monica, California, although she was, as many of you know, a very popular anonymous blogger for many years, which, by the way, is a great thing about blogs. Nobody knew who you were and nobody cared. They loved what you were saying. So she also writes the Big Con blog at ourfuture.org. Pam Spalding is the editor and publisher of Pam's Houseblend, honored as the best LGBT blog in 2005 and 2006 for the Weblog Awards. And it was launched in July 2004 as a personal response to the anti-gay state of the political landscape. It is ranked in the top 50 progressive political blogs and averages, I'm told, 120,000 visitors a month. Finally, Terrence Heath is the online producer at Campaign for America's Future. He blogs at the Republic of Tea and previously worked at Echo Ditto, the Human Rights Campaign, and the National Minority AIDS Council. So we're just going to begin with a question for Chris here. You're welcome to respond to any of the questions or depressing ideas I tried to raise in the opening, but also I'm asking you to speak to the root causes and catalysts of blog activism. You, of course, have done a lot of polling of the blogosphere or the larger Netroots, and one question that always comes up is, where do we go when the underlying causes of our activism fades? When Bush is gone, can we move from a protest model to a governance model? And if you could, speak to anything specific that's worked or failed in the blogosphere's relations with the current Congress.
Sure. The first thing I'd like to say is I'm not convinced that we're entering some era where America is openly embracing a post-partisan or post-ideological agenda. I mean, political studies have shown that most Americans are not hardline ideologues. And that doesn't mean that they're moderate. It just means that they don't have a thoroughgoing, coherent ideological view of the world. But if we really were entering this great era of post-partisanship, where are the third-party candidates? There are no third-party members of the House of Representatives or governors. The third-party share of the vote is actually declining. Republican moderates are still being consistently taken out within Republican primaries. And now with Donna Edwards, we were actually able to take out a corporate Democrat and Al Wynn and replace him with a progressive Democrat. So it feels very much to me as though I don't see bipartisan or moderate or third-party candidates performing very well electorally. We have the example of Barack Obama, but that's not the only thing in his message. His message is not just let's end partisan rhetoric. That's not the only thing going on in his campaign. So I did want to address that. On my website, Open Left, I have a post up right now that lists in more detail the 5 root causes of the rise of the progressive blogosphere. And I'm just going to go over them really quick right now so that I can answer Ari's questions and we can move down the panel. But the 5 main causes for the rise of the progressive blogosphere or online political activism more generally over the past decade are, first, I would say, we're living in an era over the past decade of vastly increased political activism. Reversing long-standing trends from the 70s and 80s and 90s, now every indicator of political activism, at least in terms of electoral politics, is increasing. Voter turnout is up. The number of people donating and volunteering to campaigns is up. There's vastly increased numbers of people who believe that the outcome of elections matter. In fact, since the advent of public polling, there have never been as many Americans who believe that it matters which party is in charge as they do right now. So we've entered an era of increased engagement in politics that could possibly be because people feel we're in a crisis situation over, September 11th or Iraq or global warming or the 2000 election that, or some that I think was stolen, but as I imagine many other people do as well. And then it seems like there's a lot more at stake, and so so citizen engagement in the process is significantly increasing. The second cause, I think, for the rise of the progressive blogosphere was that there was a lack of progressive voices in other media. And that's, while there is a long-standing conservative alternative media empire from talk radio to, mostly talk radio, but also in print and on television, progressive media is something that's really only risen significantly in the last 10 years, and there was a very large opening for more progressive voices to emerge because there's demand for it, there's a marketplace for it, and it simply wasn't being served. The third cause, I would say, is simply that conservatism was on the rise, and progressive power within politics was on a very sharp decline from 1994 on, straight through 2004 and 2005, that there probably wasn't a time period since the 1920s where progressive power within American politics was at such a low point. And so the need to respond to that probably seemed very imperative to a lot of liberals and progressives. Let's see here. Oh yeah, obviously the emergence of the internet vastly decreased the cost of information and self-publishing, self-organizing technology. No one else was really organizing the progressive creative class, and it became possible for that class to sort of start organizing itself through MoveOn.org or social networking sites or blogs, because it became a lot cheaper to start organizing. Excuse me. It simply became a lot cheaper to start finding people around the country, to start making connections, and to start creating your own means of media distribution. So that's what I had for now.
Great. Okay. So Tracy, if you could speak from your perspective from Democratic organizing, the Edwards campaign, are we looking at a presidential primary? Chris says maybe the death of partisanship has been greatly overreported. But we have also seen candidates like John Edwards and others not do as well despite great Netroots support. Now, these are complicated issues. It's not like he lost because or in spite of the Netroots. But do you think that blogs and the Netroots are still potentially much more powerful at the local level or in local races? And while we care a great deal about national issues, whether it's the presidential campaign or Iraq, the opinions on the Daily Kos poll and the hard work of patriotic activists there don't seem to be able to move the needle yet in this environment?
No, I truly believe that if we had more recommended diaries each day, we would have taken it. But that's a failure we're going to have to live with. So I think there's a couple of questions that come into play here, and a very important question to ask is, first of all, unlike 2004, there wasn't a blogosphere-wide consensus, and the idea that there would be is kind of naive, because the internet is a very big place. And the Beltway media considers the liberal blogosphere to be 5 people. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are engaging in this discussion every day, all over the internet, in different places, on different blogs. So unlike 2004, when the medium was just embryonic in its early stages, there isn't a consensus. So I think the debate has been much more vibrant among activists. And there's not just questions of partisanship, but questions of personality, because ultimately, I think most people would agree that on a number of issues, the candidates are incredibly similar. And where there are key differences, those differences tend to be wonky and in the weeds, and aren't differences that, they're differences that someone could debate very well in a blog format, but across the kitchen table to a mom who's worried about getting dinner on the table, getting laundry done, and getting an hour to herself before she has to be up for work the next day, it's not something that translates, I think, into the kind of American consciousness. So things that the Netroots or the blogosphere might focus on to incredible degrees of detail aren't things that translate to the American public. What you do see, though, is the ability of the progressive blogosphere and progressive candidates to partner on issues and really make a difference on things. A couple of examples that I kind of thought to illustrate that would be the Fox debates early in the cycle, when I was not with the Edwards campaign, but with another organization, and it was my job to say, no, Democrats should debate in front of many audiences. The progressive blogosphere thought, no, they should not, and found a partner in that cause in John Edwards, and were able to leverage their pressure with John Edwards' sign-on to the other candidates to cancel the debate. And so it isn't something I think that you can't take one without the other. There has to be a partner that you work with in a cause. I mean, you saw that yesterday when Darcy Berner and 10 challengers unveiled their responsible plan. Like, they have done that, and they have leveraged their policy proposal with the support of hundreds of grassroots activists who helped get it off the ground, and using the Netroots and the internet to leverage that message. Other examples, which Chris was very involved with, was the issue of residual troops and injecting that question into the debate and making people see that there was a difference on the candidates on Iraq. I tend to not actually agree with Chris's assessment of those differences, but there is a difference. There's a difference on healthcare and the issue of a mandate and what that means to achieving universal healthcare. And so, in all of these issues, these are things that previously I think a candidate could have gotten away with putting out a white paper, making a bland press statement, and moving on. But now they're held to like a much higher level of accountability by progressive activists who say, no, I know that there's a difference when there isn't a mandate in your plan, or no, leaving combat troops to fight Al-Qaeda is not getting out of Iraq, or what have you. And so in that way, we've seen the bloggers and the Netroots basically leverage their cause upwards, so that have filtered through the media, forced the media to cover it, and created more of a conversation around these issues that we care passionately about. But lastly, I think you just need to look at the economy of scale. I mean, a presidential election is kind of a big target. And if you have a congressional, election, and you raise, say, $500,000 for a congressional candidate, that is huge. I mean, that could be an entire campaign right there. But $500,000 is what some of us raise in a day in a presidential campaign, and so the the question of how that is effective isn't nearly the same.
Well, brings us to another big target I want to ask Heather about, which is there's one thing that Obama, Clinton, and McCain supporters all agree on. The media sucks. And you find that in every activist group. As soon as you know a lot about an issue, it's like a gateway drug. You end up on media reform because you see your issue misrepresented, you see a candidate misrepresented, I think. So what are we learning, because you write about this a lot, Heather, in effective ways to pressure the media to be more factual, transparent, and fair, and less superficial, melodramatic, sexist, racist, and elitist? And can you share with us any ideas about media pressure efforts online during this presidential campaign or on related issues that you think can be effective?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the blogosphere, you know, has had a few successes over the last few years. We're getting better at it. But really, it's one of the main reasons why I think the blogosphere came to pass. It was a frustration with the mainstream media and how to influence it to become, you know, more responsive. And it, you know, it's not just simply a case of wishing that our you know, that they reflected our candidates' issues better or were fairer. I mean, it's truly a sort of an institutional vision that we have of trying to get the media to be more responsive in general. In the past, when we first started off, I think it was really a response to what happened in the 90s, which was, at the time, the media was responding to you know, a sort of a tabloidization that came along with the 24-hour cable news networks, a very effective right-wing noise machine, which was feeding a lot of information out into the ether, and through talk radio and other venues. Fox News came online during that period. And so the news media seemed to, at least from the perspective of somebody just watching it outside the institution itself, was a rather shocking, sort of shallow, trivial approach to the news. And so we all responded with things like Move On, and we joined groups, and we did whatever. And the blogosphere came along, and suddenly we had our soapbox. And one of the first things that happened was that you know, the Atrios, one of our biggest and longest-lasting bloggers, actually dug up an old Dixiecrat document from 1948 when he found out that Trent Lott had said that that he thought that Strom Thurmond, you know, that the country would have been a lot better off if Strom Thurmond had been elected. And when you saw that Dixiecrat document online and saw what it said, it was shocking. That kind of thing just couldn't have been done before. And what happened was, it happened over a long weekend. The media hadn't paid any attention to it, had thought Trent's statement was just, you know, another nice tribute to an elderly gentleman. And when they came back to work on Monday morning, they saw that people all over the blogosphere were aghast at what had happened. And it affected politics. Trent Lott lost his majority status. I mean, it wasn't the only reason that he did. Obviously, there were factors at play within the Bush administration and other things that more or less used that as an excuse to put in their own fellow there. But nonetheless, it did have an effect. And over time, we saw that more and more of those things. One of the most effective ways that the blogosphere learned to deal with the media was to write specifically about the media. I mean, you know, like anybody else, they like to read about themselves. And so, you know, if you write about the media a lot, you look at your Technorati search and you'll see names coming up of different journalists and different writers. And I can't imagine who's doing that except for the journalists and writers themselves, who are looking to see what's being said about them that day. So it's a way of grabbing attention, I think, that you know, when we write specifically about certain journalists. And, you know, over time, many things have happened. Tools have come along, you know, blogs like Talking Points Memo, for instance, which is actually more than a blog. It's actually a, you know, an online newspaper of sorts at this point. During the Social Security privatization push by the Bush administration right after the election in 2004, they actually, Josh Marshall, marshaled his readers to look on local media and report back what representatives and various others were saying about Social Security privatization. And he put it all in one place. And that was very valuable. That showed that people were watching. It gave everybody who happened to be reading in that district, a way to go to the town meeting and to confront their representatives. That was something new that had happened, and that was using the media out in the country, the local media and the statewide media, and even local television shows, and bringing it back into the blogosphere on a national level, letting us all look at it. And so that feedback coming back and forth between readers, local media, and national media was kind of the first time that sort of thing had happened, and it was actually pretty powerful. It was, I think everybody acknowledges that Josh and other people who were involved, like Chris Bowers here in the There Is No Crisis campaign, truly did help to derail that pernicious legislation that Bush was about during that period when he had his alleged mandate from 2004. And since then we've done many other things on an individual basis. These things come up, the blogs get involved, they send feedback to the ombudsman of various newspapers. Recently during this campaign, as we've seen, 2 historic candidates, we're seeing an awful lot of some old and rather unpleasant racial and racist and sexist commentary starting to bubble up to the surface. The blogs have been on that from the beginning, and regardless of where anybody stands on the campaigns themselves, I think we all agree, no matter what, that there's no room for that in our media. And in fact, groups like Media Matters, which was formed to document the atrocities, essentially, of the mainstream media and the right-wing media, and have done a tremendous job, have given us this database, this institutional memory of what people are saying. And so you can compile all this information now as a blogger or anyone else as a reader and sort of see what's being said. And there was a confrontation with MSNBC over comments made by Chris Matthews over a long period of time, and he was forced to apologize. Recently, Firedog Lake put together a tool where you could contact local media and write letters to the editor, which was done to combat this pernicious smear that's out there about Senator Obama being unpatriotic. And there was an AP report that was written. They ended up sending 15,000 letters through the blogosphere to local media throughout the country protesting an AP report that was very biased on this subject and could have been written by a right-wing operative. And so, they move very quickly. But just to finish up, I think there's one thing that the blogosphere does that's tremendously important, and Ari hit on it in his opening statement, which is that we create the alternative narrative. And at times, as in the run-up to the Iraq War, that can sometimes be the only place that you can find that. There were protests all over the world, certainly in the United States. There was a large, large minority of Americans who did not agree with that policy to go to invade Iraq. And yet you could find it virtually nowhere in the media. It was very, very difficult to see. And in fact, we've since learned that the media had made a conscious effort to suppress that information. They didn't want to put the protests on the front page. They didn't want to discuss it. Certain talk show hosts were let go over trying to expose that side of the story. And the blogs kept that story going. And not only did we keep it going, we passionately kept it going. And I think the result of that, obviously we didn't change anything. They were, with the help of the mainstream media, the administration managed to do that, and we're still feeling the horrible repercussions of that decision. But when things started to go the other way, when people realized probably from the beginning, when the weapons of mass destruction weren't found, the main rationale for going in, and people began to realize that this was a mistake. Perhaps just the veil of 9/11 was lifted finally, and people were able to sort of think straight. That narrative that had been out there was there and ready. The press had been reading it, others had been reading it. It wasn't as if people had to go back to square one and try and reconstruct what happened. It was there. We'd written it, we were still writing it. And so I think it's extremely valuable at this time when, there's so much media, there's so much out in the ether floating around, that these storylines continue to be written by people who are outside the mainstream. And, you know, that's going to continue through this campaign. I mean, everybody's talking about the campaign. We all have our thoughts, our passions, what have you. But one of the things is that we we're still writing about Iraq. We're still pressing candidates and others to continue to discuss that. We're helping them with this responsible plan that Tracy talked about. And so that story, in spite of the fact that it may be starting to disappear and people are calling it a success, we will be writing that still. And I think that's going to be valuable as hopefully on January 21st, 2009, when the Democrats take the majority power in Washington, and we are 20th, sorry, and we will be able to, affect that change. That this story will not be disappeared completely.
And it brings us perfectly to what I wanted to ask Pam about, which is battling and counterpunching these right-wing smears. You have done a lot with the alternative discourse around gay Americans, gay politics, and hate speech against gays, and as well dealing with that in the context of something that's challenging for everyone, no matter where you are in the spectrum, which is the context of religion, which is very personal to people, and which is a legitimizing or moralizing force for many people, although it can be mixed, as we all know, with bigotry and has to be battled like any bigotry. So could you walk us through your thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say is that the thing about blogs that I think perplexes a lot of the political establishment is they don't know how to harness the blogs, and they don't know how to fight the blogs, and they don't want to integrate us somehow into the media stream or communications stream, because that would mean ceding power of some kind. And I think that that's also true of institutional organizations such as the religious right. They rarely know how to respond to a blog swarm or media campaign that comes up from the grassroots. I think good examples of that are efforts against James Dobson and Focus on the Family, where you're going out and people are finding information about certain themes that run through the right wing, since they're so good at doing talking points, referring to research by Paul Cameron, who's been discredited by the American Psychological Association for being a proponent of all gay men die before the age of 43 or whatever, with these bogus statistics, but they get repeated on the air over and over, and most of the hosts in the mainstream media don't question it. There's no time to question it. They've got only a couple of minutes to talk about that. But that's where the blogs come in, to go and pull that research, pull how people have been discredited, and disseminate it. I think what's really been powerful is the use of resources like Media Matters and Brave New Films to spread virally the counterattack to the right, or even counterattack within. Talking about Fox and the CBC Congressional Black Caucus debate and how successful that was in turning people off and making people aware of what the dialogue has been. And you don't have to just let the right speak for itself. I mean, all they had to do was gather up clips of guest after guest on Fox and let it just speak for itself. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I was just enormously grateful they pulled Jesse Lee Peterson, a minister who is incredibly homophobic, a self-loathing black man who got on the air and blamed blacks for the suffering in the dome after Katrina. I mean, you can't get any better than that. And you need to just allow that kind of bubbling up from the grassroots. To be able to put that clip on a blog and spread it around is incredibly valuable. It makes the contributions of a very small, relatively small number of people seem like a huge mass of something that needs to be responded to by the mainstream media. I think it's always funny that you see a lot of the discussion that happens on blogs ends up in mainstream media, but is never credited. Well, for better or for worse, that's okay with me. I think that the important thing is that it's out there. It's really a difficult challenge when you are actually attacking the media itself, because they're not going to be self-reporting on the criticism that's always lodged against them. I think the whole Chris Matthews episode and the Tweety effect really did show how the circle the wagons mentality around their star means that the discussion happens, but you're going to see more of it online than you're going to see in the mainstream media. I also think that some of the right-wing talk radio hosts get away with a lot, as does the religious right talk radio people. These are people like the Concerned Women for America that often has broadcasts that they send out to their readers that are much more incredibly inflammatory than they are when they have their posts on their website or press releases that go out. They will, again, cite statistics that are meaningless, statistics that are wrong, specifically about gay lifespans. They're coming after your children. I think a really good example of that and how it can play out in national politics overall in this election is looking at some of the smaller races and smaller, less known elected officials who are held accountable. I think a good example of this is Representative Sally Kern in Oklahoma, who said an incredible thing that homosexuality, no society that has accepted homosexuality has lasted more than a couple of decades, and that we are coming after your children, we're taking over city councils. She said this was recorded, it was put up on a YouTube, and it was received over a course of 3 or 4 days, over 1 million views. This was spread virally. She had to go on and try to explain herself. She has had to deal with hundreds and thousands of emails flooding in, calls from elected officials. This is the kind of thing that people can mobilize at the grassroots level, and it all bubbles up. And I think that example can be followed and replicated.
We have a Take Back America tradition now. We save the most boring for last. And I say that because it's true, but it also is the question I want to pose to Terrence, which is, we have gone through and we spoke in advance about different areas of focus, from how do grassroots activists get involved, to presidential politics, to media reform, to battling hate mongers. All of those things, at least for political junkies, are somewhat exciting. And while we also care deeply about policy, that's, I think, what animates many of us to do the other things. Policy is often less exciting. And online, where we're building communities and trying to grab people or trying to go viral, a sensational comment from the left or the right or somewhere else altogether still moves virally much better than a 14-point white paper. But particularly because we're fortunate to have so many people here who are deeply versed in policy, Terrence is going to speak to us about the challenge and any ideas for basically taking a group like Campaign for America's Future, other groups you've consulted for, and how do you get deeper, serious ideas traction online and with activists, knowing that you're never going to be quite as exciting or enraging as the latest crazy smear that we're counterpunching.
Actually, I couldn't have asked to be in a better position coming after Pam's comments and after Heather's comments, because one of the things that I've been in, my work as a consultant and previously with Echo Ditto, is something of kind of a long tail, or as David Sifry put it, magic middle evangelist, and trying to get people to understand that the political blogosphere is not just 5 people, and that you have to look. For me, when I'm doing outreach work and looking for places for organizations or people to interact in the blogosphere, beyond quote-unquote names, beyond numbers, and looking for people who are effective in their spheres, because it's really not the blogosphere, it's the blogospheres. It's plural. People are creating their own spheres. There are smaller blogospheres around just about every issue and organized around every interest or identity group you can imagine, and there's a lot of work going on within those groups. There are a lot of things that I've seen and I've actually been a part of, starting out with mid-level bloggers and bubbling up into the media and getting a response that they would not have otherwise gotten. Probably if Laurel Hester's story had happened 10 or 15 years ago, nobody would have ever heard about it, but there was a documentary made about her struggle against lung cancer and against discrimination because she was a lesbian and wanted to pass her pension on to her partner. There was an Oscar-winning documentary made about it, Freeheld, that just won the Best Oscar Short Subject. That was a story that was grabbed by bloggers in the gay and lesbian blogosphere and literally just churned up into the mainstream media until it landed on the front page of the New York Times. I've seen it happen with other stories that I've been involved with as well. I can tell you later about a 16-year-old kid named Zach. But what I advise people to do is to look for people who are doing that work, and that means digging into places like Technorati and looking at smaller spheres of the blogosphere where people are addressing the issues that you're working with. There's a lot of research that's been done that suggests that those folks in the middle tend to have more engaged readerships and are able to engage more with their readerships. And there's an opportunity there to tap into talent that hasn't been accessed and that is somewhat off the beaten path. And what organizations, I think, have a chance to do is to literally build a farm team of people that are passionate about your message and that will do what I think you want to do, which is beyond the hot and sexy, getting something from your blog into the mainstream media and generating thousands of letters or phone calls to someone's office or some representative or some political organization or body, creating a context for your message and for your ideas. One of the things that I was attracted to when I came to CAF was the Big Con, because I'd actually been through Katrina and other stories working on the same theme, and to be in a place where you can put all of that together and take different stories that get maybe 3 minutes worth of attention in the media or in a news report, and in a 3-paragraph or 4 or 5-paragraph blog post, put them together in a way that makes sense to people and in a way that carries your message, is something that I think there are a lot of people out there already doing. I know there are a lot of people out there already doing, and I think that with a little bit more effort and looking into those communities and into those areas, there's a huge amount of talent that that can be tapped, that the right wing has been a lot more effective in doing in a number of ways than I think progressives have.
Great. I want to do a real quick pop quiz, which is always good in the middle of a panel. But so we know what you know, I'm just going to run through a couple of those internet campaigns that were referenced, and if people could give me a show of hands whether you had heard about it before today, I think that'll help inform where we go. And then Chris wanted to give a response. How many people knew about the Fox CBC effort? Right. The Trent Lott, Strom Thurmond effort online. Okay. The Firedog Lake effort to reach out to the Associated Press on Obama patriotism stories. Fewer. The Residual Troops campaign to make that an issue in 2008 through the blogs. Okay, only a handful. Talking Points memo on Social Security. Okay. MSNBC Chris Matthews issues. How could you not? And YouTube Sally Kern. Great. So that gives us a sense of which of these have really exploded. We have a very informed audience here, but even here, some of these issues that folks are really excited about haven't cut across the whole room, let alone the whole country. But Chris, what did you want to say?
Oh, I just wanted to echo one of Terrence's points, which I thought was very important, is that not only is the blogosphere more than 5 people, there is no progressive political blogosphere as such. If you look at linking patterns between blogs, there are numerous blogospheres within a larger overall frame, and even within some of the particularly larger blogs. Daily Kos, for example, operates for weeks on end sometimes now without Marcos even writing on Daily Kos. And so it's much more diverse. There's lots of smaller spheres creating and getting things done, and I just thought that was a great point, and I wanted to echo it.
And we will start taking questions. What I hope to do is have people start lining up, and I will take questions and then maybe ask more of my own, but please go ahead and storm the mic. Think of it like a comment section, if that helps kind of get you
First.
pumped. Yes, sir.
I just started my blog, GaryGoldsmith.com, and therefore I've introduced myself to you. And I know this is all new to me. Is there any advice you can give me to get as far as getting it out there and getting it read? And I'm not getting the kind of hits on it that I'd like to get. I don't know. I just thought maybe you could speak to that.
Well, first of all, Gary Goldsmith is a blog everyone should check out. I don't know if that'll help. I actually would like to go to Heather on this because there is something, I'll just take an editorial comment. Blogs like Open Left, which Chris blogs for, they are more of the mainstream blogosphere. We talk about the mainstream media, they're the mainstream blogosphere. I'm saying this so Chris can furiously debate that. But the bottom line is, as soon as you have someone who is DC famous, which is its own kind of weird fame, you're in a different orbit. And that's totally different, I would argue, than an alternative blog that is anonymous or has no foothold in the discussion. And you built one just like that became very influential.
Yeah, I wrote pseudonymously for the first 4 years that I did my blog. Nobody knew even that I was female, much less my name or anything about me. So, and built a reputation doing that. What I would say is this, write interesting things. That's obviously a top thing. Do original work. Comment in other people's blogs and make yourself known. Don't, go in there just totally flogging your own stuff all the time, but that's one way that people get to participate in the community. And if you do that, I realize it's very hard for people to break through. There's, what do they say, 1 million blogs are abandoned each day or something? I mean, it's just like, a ridiculous number of them out there. But it is possible to do it, and I think nowadays the key is to participate in the greater blog community and in the Netroots, and find things that you find interesting, contact other bloggers who do that, and you'll break through. It's not impossible for sure.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I wanted to jump in with one thing, and it's a point that I tend to jump up and down about, and that is you also have to define success for yourself. People still tend to define success in blogging or anything else as big numbers, but I think that there are other ways of defining success in terms of the results that you want to achieve, and the people that you want to reach.
Well, and let's drill down on that, because I was actually going to say...
Ari, can I add to?
Yeah, I was going to go to you.
Oh, good. Fine. Good.
Tracy worked for a presidential candidate, and there's a big difference between having 10,000 hits or having 1,000, but one of them is the policy director for the John Edwards campaign. How do you get, if your goal strictly is to get on the radar of a decision maker, local, national, what would get you, Tracy, to say to someone else in the campaign, I know you've never heard of this blog, it's not Daily Kos, but you should read this?
Well, if you put my name in the post, I'll get a Google alert about it. So, and I'm sure that's the same for every other policy staffer who's in the think tank world. But I think the key for emerging bloggers is that the top space is very crowded, but there is like a lot of niche space that is still unfilled. Who do you go to when you want to know about healthcare? Well, I go to Ezra and Maggie Mahar, but I'm hard pressed to, off the top of my head, name other healthcare bloggers. So if you can find an area that can be your specialty, you can really kind of become the expert. No one is going to say, okay, you're the expert on this now. You just kind of have to show up and do the work and make that happen. Also, local blogging is huge, and so much potential lies there, and I think that's other things to consider. I mean, if you're regurgitating the same thing that every other is on the front page of every newspaper, it's not really interesting. I have no reason to go to your blog as opposed to, Chris's blog, which is already in my top 10 of blogs to check out every day. So you just kind of have to find your space and fill it.
So, Pam, for activists, is that a good tactic? How often would you name check someone to say, I want to get this person at least aware of this critique or something? Do you do that, or do you have a different tact?
No, I do it all the time. I mean, I love name dropping, especially religious right figures, because I know they read. They write me sometimes. And even will launch attacks, personal attacks on me, which I think is a good thing. I think the more that they're exposed, the better. Now, for people in the blogosphere, in terms of name checking, I always make it very important, a very important factor when I post to link to smaller blogs, because I benefited from being linked to from larger blogs, and I appreciate that. And I have seen where there's some bloggers who will bypass the person who sent them the link to their blog and link to the original source instead of the blogger. And that's sort of like bad practice. I think that you really do need to cultivate relationships with people and help make that happen. Now, in terms of policymakers, yes, you want to name check them, you want them to read. And I know that, if Tracy's got her set to a Google alert, everybody else does too. So I think that helps build your credibility if what you do right addresses the point in a very non-emotional and rational way, that you will actually build your traffic.
There was a mention, I think it was Pam that mentioned before, that the mainstream media often doesn't want to recognize the blogosphere as a mainstream news source. But public interest groups, and I work for one, working on campaigns, very much have, or I feel like more and more, are starting to have outreach to the blogosphere as part of their overall communications plan, and really trying to figure that out and seeing it as a very viable way to get a message out because of media consolidation and a whole set of reasons. You can't often get campaigns or the right frames around an issue into mainstream press, initially at least. The challenge is, it's a slightly different beast, as we know, because it's a lot of bloggers, I feel like, are the combination of the muckraker and the organizer, so you don't want to just get added to the list to get the news release from the public interest group. So there was an example before of how the blogosphere teamed up with a candidate as far as then making an issue happen. Could you just touch on a little bit more of how bloggers and public interest groups could partner a little bit more often, how we as organizations could actually get our stories into the blogs kind of as a news source, but also I realize as an organizing tool?
Let's start with Terrence, and then I want to go to Chris on that. And if you could try to speak more to the coordination, because you have a website that actually does aspire to work sometimes on long-term campaigns with folks. And why don't you do more like a cold call, like, okay, we're not supposed to send a release, but what do we do?
Well, one of the things that when I worked with people as a consultant at Ecoditto, what I did in my research and in finding people that I connect to is finding creative ways of building relationships. You might identify, if you're, say, an organization working on healthcare, you might identify 4 or 5 people who are blogging and getting a lot of engagement around a particular subject, and give them information ahead of when it's being released, or letting them know that you have this report or that report coming out, or giving them opportunities to sit in on a conference. I've been on conference calls with people that, from being a blogger, that I would probably never have interacted with otherwise. And it gets you on their radar. It gets a relationship started, and it's not necessarily done with, okay, now you have to go post about this. But as with the media, I'm pretty sure for every time you call someone to get a story in the paper, you don't necessarily get a hit. But the more often that you make that call, the stronger that relationship becomes. The more likely it is that you're going to have more engagement there.
Chris?
One of the main keys, and it's hard for me to emphasize this enough, is that bloggers, if you want to work with them on campaigns, you have to treat them like coalition partners and not like volunteers who are going to stuff your envelopes. So often, people will say, "Can you write about this?" and here's our press release, and can you start raising money for me? And there's no sense of bringing the blogger into a shared strategy session. There's no sense of giving the blogger any sort of actual influence over the direction of the campaign. The most effective campaigns I've been on over the last year were very much on the Iraq Residual Forces campaign. Eventually, the Bill Richardson campaign asked me, what would you do if what would you do in order to try to get this to have more exposure? And so
to tell us how that started for the
Sure.
folks who don't know.
Okay, well, I had been writing a lot about how Democratic withdrawal plans were not thorough, and they said they were going to end the war, but they were leaving a lot of troops in Iraq. And then I eventually, Bill Richardson started saying the same line, and I was very excited about that. But we sort of, I felt like we were shouting into the ether for several months, but in late August, they said they wanted to do a lot more direct work together, and what would and so I suggested, well, let's cut a television ad together, and they actually said okay, and I suggested you should start putting numbers next to you should start putting specific numbers next to what other candidates are saying, like how many troops would their plans leave in Iraq, and so we cut a television ad on residual forces, which I actually wrote, and then it was the first question at the next Democratic debate the next week. And it was much the same thing with the Donna Edwards campaign. Matt Stoller, my partner at Open Left, was not simply being sent things by the Donna Edwards campaign. He was working with the Donna Edwards campaign, and he was, as a volunteer, but he was embedded with the Donna Edwards campaign, and he was in the meetings, and he had influence. And I'm just saying the key is bloggers are not just, volunteers and envelope stuffers and lackeys. If you want to work with them, you have to treat them like coalition partners.
And Chris is so mellow, I just want to hammer that with more enthusiasm. You got a couple people writing saying this campaign should run different, like you'd have any conversation after knocking on doors or having some beers. And you write it and you push it and you're smart about it, and you have a presidential campaign, a governor, a serious candidate, a former UN envoy come along and say, help me write my message, and then spend money on it. That's pretty extraordinary. And I think we also sometimes forget, or I was guilty of it in pressing Tracy, oh, well, we didn't win the entire thing, so are we irrelevant? There's a lot of space in between. And so that's really a fantastic example of success from Open Left. Pam wanted to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some basic, technical things that organizations can do to help cultivate a relationship with bloggers. And some of it seems so elementary, but I've seen it happen so many times where people will send a press release, but they won't have a link to the website of the organization so that you can link to it. People don't want to see you regurgitating a press release without some source material. Another thing is provide multimedia for the blogger. A snippet of audio, a YouTube video to link to or embed on their site. That really does add value to trying to get your message across. Preparing some kind of graphics or badges that people can run in conjunction. Graphics it's a visual medium. You want to have ways to engage the reader. The other thing is present them in bullet points. Don't give this long 3-page thing that no one's going to read. It's just not going to happen. And I think that the important thing, especially for people who provide video, because now that people have caught on that they need to engage with some multimedia, provide a transcript. There are a lot of people who don't want to take time to sit through an 8-minute YouTube, but they will copy and paste and virally spread a transcript.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Jason Rosenbaum. I write for theseminole.com, and I want to touch on something that Tracy alluded to a little bit earlier, saying that the blogosphere is a little more powerful when they're united. I'm wondering what your guys' thoughts is on, if we're moving from a minority movement in a minority party to hopefully in November and January to a growing progressive movement inside of a majority party, what you think that's going to do to the blogosphere, both in terms of unity and power and kind of overall, position on the political landscape.
Thank you. Heather, you've written about this, and you've written about also the divisions in the 08 campaign on your own blog. What do you think?
I think it's a big challenge for us. I think up to now we've been, an oppositional force, basically opposing the Bush administration, the conservative movement. And so it is a challenge for us to come together. There's a lot more ideology in the blogs than there was, and certainly the campaign. We're like everybody else in the Democratic Party. We're pulling for our various candidates and doing it with everything we have. I suspect that that's not going to be a problem. Bloggers are sophisticated political participants who will, come together at the end of all of this and get behind whoever the nominee turns out to be. But as far as I think I have greater concerns about the blogosphere and the netroots in general, being able to exert leverage and influence after the election. I think that is a challenge that we're facing, is how we come together to influence a new administration, hopefully a very sizable Democratic majority to stay on the progressive path, and how we define that. I don't honestly know. I think that a lot of smart people are thinking about it. I think that people are beginning to coordinate in new ways. Blogs are forming into different entities all the time. It's a very dynamic movement. Things like Open Left, who are working consciously with various interest groups. We've seen campaigns recently, like with the FISA legislation, that have been quite successful, at least to the point of ensuring that it wasn't another one of those pieces of legislation that just fell through the cracks. We're very passionate about it and work together. So I think that as I said, I think it's a challenge, but I think it's something that will be very interesting, and I think that we will find some new avenues for expressing ideology within the blogosphere, and it'll be fun to watch over the next couple of years and see how we do it.
Terrence?
I think probably one of the challenges is just being a progressive movement in a larger party and being in a position, hopefully after the elections, of how do you hold people's feet to the fire and keep things moving in a progressive direction. And I think that's actually an area where bloggers can be immensely helpful in terms of the degree of independence that people have. I think there's a little bit of a tug of war in some ways when you've got an organization bringing in bloggers and what degree of independence they're going to have. But I think that there is a lot of potential there to keep pushing post-election, to keep pushing things in a much more progressive direction.
And I want to go to Tracy. One of the things that the really successful blogs seem to do is they unite roles. So they are fundraisers, and they are reporters, and they are supporters. They basically do what you weren't allowed to do in the old days, which is wear a bunch of hats, depending on the day, depending on the issue, depending on the need. It can be very frustrating for campaigns who say, look, you want to grill me like a journalist, fine, I will give you access, but that's one mode. You want to be a coalition partner, that's another, as Chris was saying. And you can completely understand why a campaign with a message or a policy institution with specific goals is highly uncomfortable trying to do both. And so that, I think, is actually part of the tension, too. Tracy, do you want to speak to any of that or anything from Terrence?
Sure. Just to kind of jump off of Terrence's point, I think that, if any of us think that the day a Democrat is inaugurated into the White House that, angels are going to sing in the heavens, we're a little bit naive. I think we're going to have a huge fight on our hands to enact the kind of policies that we have all been pushing our candidates to support. Our majorities in Congress are tenuous at best. We've seen that with FISA, for example, or voting on the war because, some of our new freshmen are intimidated that they could, lose in 2008. And so, we still have a very large fight ahead of us, and it's going to be even more important to work in partnership because, the idea that the conservatives would just, lie down and say, okay, we lost, I just don't see happening. I just see
But
getting...
that's what they always do. Oh, no, wait, that's us. I'm sorry.
Yes, yes.
I got confused.
I think that's vicious and nasty, and, I don't know, look at the West Wing. CJ still had a lot of work to do.
But they will have their own politicians resign if they do something wrong, won't they?
Oh, well, yeah, of course, duh.
Why don't we take...
Well,
you're not done.
I just wanted to, and then the question of organizations kind of dealing with bloggers who wear multiple hats is kind of a question of recognizing who you're dealing with. I think that you have to, organizations need to not treat bloggers as an ATM. They are not there to give you money. They are not there to regurgitate your press release. They are there because they are activists. And
Well, let's drill down, though, because for the lady who was running an organization, what if you say to Chris, what are you? And he says, well, I can't tell you, or it depends on the day, because that's the conversation. These things aren't clear. So what do you do?
Well, I think the thing is that before you ask Chris that question, you know what Chris cares about, and you read Chris, and you know what issues are going to interest him. And so if there's something that I have that I want Chris to write about it, I'm not going to say, hey, Chris, can you write about this? I'm going to say, hey, Chris, did you see this? We did this today. Is this something you're interested in? If so, let me get you more information.
But does it work to say, yes, you can come to one of our strategy meetings, but it's strictly off the record forever and you trust the person, like a reporter? Does that work?
It does if you trust the person. I mean, I know tons of reporters who go to off the record, things when they're like doing profile pieces of candidates. They travel with the candidate, they're in with the candidate, and it's
And
a
to give
level-
people, I want to drill a little bit, so to give the audience a sense, when you were on the Edwards campaign, how many bloggers would you say you had that, tier one tight relationship with?
Well, I've been doing this for a while, so.
Well, we know you rock, that's why you're up here. But I mean, can people expect to bring a dozen or 24 bloggers to something and keep it private? Because a lot of
Well-
people are worried about how does this work? Are they risking their own operation?
Sure. I mean, I regularly, kind of the top tier of bloggers would talk to, I don't know, a dozen of the kind of nationally prominent folks, check in with them every day and say, this is where you're at, off the record, this is going this way. But in addition to that, I mean, we had a core of blog activists, the people who are recommending diaries and commenting and doing those kind of things, who were just honestly like foot soldiers for us, that we had conference calls with before and after every single debate, that we worked in partnership with on a daily basis at the highest levels of access to our campaign. And that is a team of people that we built and we recruited for and we very actively worked with. And it's a matter of like respecting the blogger and respecting the activist and knowing what is going to interest them. And it's not a superficial relationship. I mean, it's not their job, like a reporter's job is to cover some beat. Like,
Right.
It's their choice.
And let's take two in a row as we're getting near the end here. 2 questions.
Well, let me ask you this. If that is a question for me. If you have a reporter whose job it is to report the news, and then you have an editorial page which is different from that, where they comment on the news. And those are 2 different jobs with 2 different sort of ethical views of the world, right? So what is a blogger, and how is your job different from that? And how do you see it differently?
Okay,
Right.
and let's take one more and then we'll do both.
It's sort of the same question. With Josh Marshall being the exception, I think, that proves the rule, I think the blogs, in my mind, have largely failed to keep up with other online media sources in terms of monetizing their traffic and pushing the edge technologically. My vision for the blogs is not that they would keep the mainstream media honest, but that they would replace the mainstream media. And Josh Marshall, frankly, is the only guy I see taking the steps, moving in that direction. I appreciate the comments of the panel.
And let's do the third too, since those were similar.
Really quick, my name is Brandon White. I'm a blogger for the superspade.com. Quick question for the panel. It seems to me the real power of blogs is being able to have everyone sort of be on the same page, if you will. And obviously it's very easy to organize around Bush, very easy. Assuming that we have a Democratic president, majority, how do you see systematically blogs being able to come together to really focus on the same page for things like things I worked on the CBC-Fox debate, which was a very successful campaign, but I just don't see how in 2009 that we will be able to say, hey, we're all going to work on this, because we have been waiting for so long to get our issues addressed at the national level.
Chris, why don't you handle the definitional question, Heather, on monetizing traffic or why it's hard, and then maybe we'll go to Terrence on the final question.
Okay. A blogger, it's not a profession with a defined set of rules. A blog is simply a form of self-publishing. And if you're a blogger, that means simply that you own and operate a small self-publishing outlet. And the ethics around that and the topics around that are going to vary widely. Blogging is not one thing. I actually don't think journalism is one thing, and I largely reject the notion that there's an abstract code of journalistic standards, but that's a separate issue. And I think it just gets at what Tracy says. Some bloggers would consider themselves to be more focused on reporting. Some, such as myself, I would consider myself more of a progressive activist who owns and operates a fairly small media outlet. And that's the way I view myself. And as Tracy said, you have to know individually who you are dealing with, because blogging is not any one thing. It varies from from blog to blog, from outlet to outlet, and from person to person. And you have to know who you're dealing with in order for it to be effective.
With respect to replacing the mainstream media, I don't actually think that that's going to happen. I think what's happening is that the mainstream media is, by and large, going to move online, and that you're going to find a broad spectrum of online media, whether or not it's the individual blogger like me, or organizations like the Big Con, at the Campaign for America's Future site, or what Chris is doing, a variety of media. It's actually going to be a very rich media environment, and each individual is going to have to decide who they are going to read each day, and that's a challenge for everybody. As for monetizing, I think it's working itself out. I mean, it's very difficult. This is a new entrepreneurial project. Advertising, obviously, we get a tremendous amount of reader support. There is the grant model. And all of those things are going to work together and are working together and probably will over time. There's still always going to be the amateur blogger who just gets a Blogspot account and decides to write and gets a few people to read it. And that's a great thing as well. It doesn't all have to be professional. But that's where I see it. I think it's all going to be online, and you're going to have to decide which among us you're going to trust and read and use as your source for news.
And we're going to go to Terrence for Brandon's question, although anyone else please pipe in, because it is the big question and a good one to wrap up on. What is the agenda? Heather said earlier, the blogosphere started as more of a political project and less of a traditional ideological project, but we see more ideology. And I don't think yes, there's great diversity as we've discussed, but if you look at the top fights that the top blogs have had success on in the last several years, they focus on certain issues. They focus on Iraq, they focus on battling surveillance, restoring constitutional rights, a model of economic populism and supporting candidates who do that, and less ideologically, a model of confrontational politics. In general, I would argue, and if maybe we all disagree, so it's a nice point to end on, but I would argue they don't focus on, for example, pro-choice issues, which are very important to our movement. And they don't focus overwhelmingly on international aid, international development, and frankly on a lot of foreign policy outside of Iraq. Neither does the traditional media, and you can't focus on everything, so this isn't an indictment. But there are, I believe, a set of issues that have come pretty close to an agenda. And so to Brandon's question for Terrence and everyone else, how do we get on the same page? Is that agenda legitimate? Do we need, because of the nature of our participatory ethic online and because of the nature of liberals who are always debating each other, do we need to ensure that there's always an avenue to contest that agenda, or does this get more concretized and less open source? And you only have 90 seconds to answer.
All right, well, there's one of the presidential candidates says that, it comes down to the person who knows what they're going to do on day one. As a progressive blogger, I know what I'm going to do on day one. On day one, there are a number of different issues that no matter who's in the White House, no matter who has a majority in Congress, I'm still going to be jumping up and down about. Winning office, winning a majority, winning power is only half the fight as far as I'm concerned. Winning the argument about where we go as a country is the rest of the fight. And for me as a progressive blogger, it's about making the promises of this country more accessible to more people. That's what it's been about, from the abolitionist movement to the civil rights movement to the suffragist movement to the gay and lesbian movement. And that work will not end the day after the election. It'll begin, I hope.
And
Pam? Or
I would
Tracy
just
and
say
then
that in terms of what the issue agenda is, I mean, there's a lot of people have a lot of agendas, and maybe that's a failing of our party or movement is sometimes that, you can't wake someone up in the middle of the night and say, what do progressives stand for? Because they'll be like, what? But if you wake someone up, a Republican up in the middle of the night, they're going to be like, stay the course. What it is. It's very, very easy. And so, but at the same time, all of these diverse coalitions are if you want to know about pro-choice issues on any given day, feministing.com will have something you can chew up and spit out. So I mean, and there's a number of feminist bloggers that are right there with her every single day. There is some atrocity that women are outraged about and are writing about. But, you know, the larger kind of blogosphere movement, the they that you're referring to, is kind of non-existent, because, you know, if a judicial nominee comes up and the question is, you know, are our rights going to be protected, that kind of farm team, if you will, of more very specific issue experts come up to the front, and they kind of have their moment in the spotlight where they're the expert that week, where they're the ones everyone is linking to. And then the next week, the fight is something else, and we move on to the healthcare bloggers, or, you know, the folks over Democracy Arsenal if it's foreign policy. I mean, there are these multiple spheres, which Chris and Terrence have both talked about, that are incredibly powerful in and of themselves, but there's a capacity issue that you can't read everyone every single day. But it's empowering those different groups to be experts in those areas.
I think one of the dangers that we face after the election is that we have this pool of talent out there, the A-list, the B-list, the C-list, and on. But they're not, most of these people are citizen bloggers. They have full-time day jobs, and they're blogging on the side. And they may, in fact, be those experts that you want to link to, but you know what? They may not be able to continue to sustain their blog. So how important are those specific voices to our movement generally? And we need to think about that. Is that the conservatives have no problem funding and thinking long-term. And I don't think we have put that kind of emphasis on that.
Well, actually, there's one thing a couple of things I would probably say, and I'll shut up for now, is that there are some things that I see happening. One of the things we have at CAF that I think is very encouraging is that we have bloggers who are fellows or senior fellows who are supported in some way, shape, or form by the organization. I'm one of those day job bloggers that, like, you know, I have my blog that got me into all of this, which I'm usually nowadays supporting and writing while I'm making a bottle and changing a diaper at this point. But I think that there is a lot that's getting started, and hopefully that we'll see more of from organizations that are willing to support bloggers who, because it is hard, not everyone is going to be able to monetize their readership and make their living off of their blog. It's just not going to happen. And so there has to be a way of finding that talent in the middle and supporting it, and maybe building a relationship and building that those people as experts, or whatever you want to call them. And then the only other thing that I had on my mind was that the two words "for all." There's on our website. There's economy for all. There's healthcare for all, and I think that's the umbrella of all of these different issues, of all of these different interest areas that people work on, that people talk about, and that people support. And I hope that Progressive comes to embody that. That eventually everything that this country promises on paper, it will promise for all.
Thank you. So in closing, because we got to get out of here, I just want to echo what Chris said, but I think it's been a theme throughout. When we talk about what these blogs are, and is it editorial, or is it argumentative, or are these outmoded, I do think it's safe to conclude that what we are talking about is the narratives and the understanding of this movement in our society and our politics is all about whether we understand the facts one way or another. In other words, the discussion about Iraq is a discussion about how we got there. And these are contested lines of inquiry. And so for people who say, well, the New York Times said it, or Rush Limbaugh said it, so I know this or that, that's part of the contested debate. And so one of the best things that I think everyone up here is good at is not being pigeonholed into these false distinctions that are often used to cabin and intimidate and control public discourse, something the right is frankly, obsessed with. But to say, no, we are going to report on a narrative a different way. And I think, again, as where I opened, if you go back and read Digby in 2001 and 2002, it reads like a different world from the Washington Post in those years. And I would submit, to stick with the example, that it's more accurate than the Washington Post, but other people would say, well, it's more political or it's more ideological. So our words have impact, our stories have impact, and a lot of the people up here are a part of this larger movement that you all are in. So thank you for being here, and thank you to our panelists.